our lecture on rising empires, 1750 to 1900. In part one of the lecture, we discussed Russia and how it had attempted to industrialize and embrace some Enlightenment reforms to keep up with the West. And so now we see how Japan is going to do that. So at the start of the time period, around 1750-ish, Japan was still under the control of the Tokugawa family. The Tokugawa was one of the large landowning noble families of Japan, and the most important landowning noble families in Japan are called daimyo, and this one particular daimyo family was called the Tokugawa. Japan was still, just like Russia in our last part of our lecture, was still largely feudal. So the people who controlled the government were primarily these daimyo, these nobility. Their power came from land ownership. And then we have a whole bunch of poor people working underneath them that are almost like semi-slaves. So this is something that it would be talked about in Russia, but Europe has kind of left this long in the past. Now, the Emperor of Japan has been around for a long time, his dynasty, his family, but throughout most of their history, as we've talked about before, he didn't really have any power. He was kind of a puppet emperor. The daimyo family and they will change over time which daimyo family is in charge, but the most powerful daimyo family, the leader of their family is called a shogun. And the shogun at this time was from the Tokugawa family. And so really the shogun had the power in Japan, and he kind of ruled through the emperor, kind of as a puppet emperor to give himself legitimacy. And so if he wants something done, he will say to the emperor, look, tell everybody to do this, say it's in your name, but really I'm telling you to do it. And so we have somewhat of a centralized government. The Tokugawa is kind of pulling the strings of the emperor, but still the other daimyo families who were jealous of the Tokugawa family are making it kind of hard for it to be too centralized. In the last time period, when we went from 1450 to 1750, we had talked about how the Tokugawa, in an attempt to limit foreign interference, the power of the exploring empires from Europe in the last time period, in order to limit their influence within Japan and to make it more stable and centralized, they isolated Japan. They kept it, except for a port, they kept the Japanese islands cut off from European influence, except for the Dutch who were able to trade at one port. So that's still continuing at the start of this time period. Now, even though Japan is isolated from most European powers at the start of this time period, they're still trading with the Dutch, and of course they're still trading with the Chinese. And through the Dutch and through the Chinese, some of the Columbian exchange crops is going to be coming into Japan from the New World. And so these new crops mean that there is going to be new food, more varied diets, and the population of Japan is increasing, which on the surface you think is a good thing for Japan. More people, more workers, those kinds of things. But it turns out it's not. Their population is growing too fast, and they can't sustain that population growth. Because as people are having, kids and they're surviving, because we have access to new crops, that's good for a while, but then our population is going to grow faster than our ability to feed the people. And it's not like Japan can put more land under cultivation. It's an island nation. Most of the land on the island is mountainous and rocky. And so Japan is going to have mass starvation happen. You can see in the picture this Japanese peasant. He doesn't have, his clothes are made of grass. He's very poor. And so we see that this is a problem. When there's starvation, people get angry, people start to protest, we start to see more crime, and so Japan is starting to have some problems. The Tokugawa are starting to have some problems inside. Another problem is, as always, high taxation. And so the Tokugawa say, look, we want to have more money, we need palaces, we need armies, we need whatever. And so the nobility are also taxing their people more. And so this puts a real strain on the peasants at the same time that we have this overpopulation and starvation. So if you're a peasant in Japan, first of all, you don't have enough food to feed yourself, and then whatever you do have, the local noble or daimyo is taking it away from you so that he can pay his taxes. One final thing about this, in our last lecture, in our last unit, when we came and talked about Japan from 1450 to 1750, we had talked about how the rising merchant class So Japan is trading with the Dutch, and they are trading with China, and there was this rising wealthy merchant class that was arising. And if we remember, we had said that they are buying titles, they're marrying into the nobility, and so a lot of these nobility got in debt, even though they're raising more taxes from the peasants, they got in debt from the merchant class. And so the peasants are struggling at this time. The nobility, the daimyo, are struggling and they're in debt. And when the peasants are upset, we have rebellions. And when the daimyo or the nobility are upset, that also causes rebellions, just on a different level, a little bit higher up in the society. And so the Tokugawa are facing some real challenges here at the start of the time period. So what do the peasants do? Well, the peasants, they can't pay their taxes to the local daimyo, and so they're forced off the land, or the starvation forces them off the land, and so they go to cities to look for jobs to escape tax collectors, and this makes the whole situation worse because now we have fewer peasants in the countryside growing food, and we have more and more people concentrated, angry in cities, just waiting to rebel. And so here is one more problem that Tokugawa have to deal with. So as I said, this all going to create a desire for reform. So let's talk about the Tokugawa reforms. So in 1841 to 43, the Tokugawa dynasty, the Tokugawa shogunate, like, okay, what can we do to make things better so we don't have a revolution and overthrow? And so the first thing they do is they decide to help the daimyo, all the other noble families underneath them that they're afraid they're going to rebel, and so they just cancel their debts. This makes them very popular with the other nobility, the daimyo in the country, and they just say, okay, any debts you owe to merchants, forget it. We're just going to cancel those because they're trying to buy the loyalty of the nobility of the daimyo. Now, also to increase production, because we have seen in other parts of the world, a little contextualization here. So now we're from 1750 to 1900. We see that in other parts of the world, industrialization has started, production has increased, and Japan has resisted industrialization. One, because the daimyo, they like the way things are. They like wealth to be based on land ownership, not on factory ownership. And so they've resisted industrialization, and so have the guilds of artisans in Japan. It's not in their interest to have factories to increase production. Guilds, we've talked about before, guilds are artisans that want to limit production to keep prices high. And so that's another force in Japan that is trying to say no to Western industrialization. So we have a second reform besides canceling debts to merchants. We have the government is going to force the peasants out of the cities and back into the countryside, back working for the daimyo nobility. They hope that this will increase food production if we put peasants back into the countryside, and that will make more food, and so then people will be less starving, and then they'll maybe be able to pay their taxes, and there'll be less riots and rebellions. Of course, this is not good for the peasantry. If nobody's forgiving their debts, nobody is giving them freedoms and democracy and liberty and listening to them. And so what we have here is a situation where the Tokugawa are certainly looking out for themselves, and they're looking out for their fellow nobles or daimyos, um, but they are not looking out for the merchant class or for the lower class. As this is all going on, we have perhaps one of the most important events in Japanese history. The United States shows up. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry, we see him on the right-hand side, he shows up with an American Navy fleet. And of course, America has already started to industrialize at this point, and they have more modern weapons. And the United States basically shows up and says to the Japanese, trade with us. We are ending your isolation. And of course, the Tokugawa do not want to do this, but they're looking at some modern battleships in their harbor, and they really have no choice. And so the Tokugawa come face to face with the idea that, oh my goodness, we cannot keep out the foreigners anymore. Isolationism has to end. Now, when England sees this happen, and when France sees this happen, and the Portuguese see this happen, they see, wow, the United States is able to force their way into get the raw materials and markets of Japan. We want some of that too. And so we see other European or Western countries show up and do the same thing. And of course, like we've talked about in the Ottoman Empire and in the Qing dynasty, they're going to use force to make the Tokugawa dynasty, sign unequal treaties, giving all of the favorable trade agreements to the foreigners, and it's going to make it really hard for the Japanese to compete. They won't be able to pass tariffs. So even if we do try to create industry in Japan and modernize, we can't do it because foreign goods are going to come in because these extraterritorial treaties said we can't tariff. Also, it gives special exemptions from Western and US merchants who come in. They don't have to follow the same laws that Japanese merchants do. So this really gives an advantage to foreigners in the Japanese economy. And this is all very humiliating to the Tokugawa. They can't even protect their own people from these foreigners. And so let's fast forward now to 1868, just another decade past this. We see that there is growing unrest in Japan of the Tokugawa family and their rule, their shogunate. And so the emperor, who, as we had said previously, really typically does not have any power, he's just a puppet ruler, he realizes he's a young man and he says, we need to modernize, we need to westernize. And we've always talked about how at this time, that means two things. That means adopt industrialization and adopt some aspects of the Enlightenment. Because we're not sure which one of those two things made the West rise to power at this time, so we better copy it all. And if you can see in the top right-hand picture, here is the Emperor of Japan, and he is in Western clothing. He has obviously adopted Westernization, and he said, no, we need to leave Japanese our culture in the past. It hasn't worked for us. And so he and some other daimos that are jealous of the Tokugawa family's power, they rise up and they overthrow the Tokugawa. This ends the Tokugawa's family as the rulers, the real rulers of Japan. And so now, for the first time since 1185, the Emperor of Japan is actually going to have power in his own right. And he is backed by some of these dissatisfied daimyo families. They didn't like the direction of Japan under the Tokugawa, and frankly just jealous of the Tokugawa's influence over the last few hundred years. So their goal, as we have said, is to westernize. So let's start with some Enlightenment reforms that they adopt from the West. First of all, even though the emperor is going to have real power, he realizes that, okay, first I have to keep the daimyo happy that followed me and rebelled against the Tokugawa, so I'm going to have to give something to them. And also, if we really want to copy the West, they've not just industrialized, but they've also adopted some Enlightenment ideas, so he is going to be a constitutional monarchy. He does have power for the first time in a long time, but not unlimited power, which is an Enlightenment idea, right? One person should not have unlimited power. And so we form the Diet, or the Diet. It is the name of the legislature that is created in Japan. They are going to make laws in conjunction with the emperor for Japan to move them quickly to a more modern country. It's going to be a bicameral legislature. The top house is going to be dominated by the daimyos, and this keeps them happy. This is a way to reward the daimyos that followed the emperor in his rebellion. And then the lower house is going to be made up of quote-unquote commoners. But really, it's still more an area where daimyos can exercise their control, and really only 5% of the Japanese common people who were not from nobility, can vote, and that's very small. And so for the most part, it's kind of a sham. It is a little bit more Enlightenment because we're not just having one family or one person rule, we're kind of spreading the power out, but it doesn't reach very far down in society. Really, Japan is being controlled by the emperor and the top daimyo, or the noble families of Japan. The emperor is going to take over control of the nation's army, and he is also going to control who is the leadership of the Diet. He is going to appoint the prime minister. So we do see that he does certainly have power. So here we see in the bottom right-hand corner, we're modernizing the army, because think about it in contextualization. This whole thing really started when the United States humiliated the Japanese government, and they weren't able to keep them out, and all these other European countries came in and forced them to sign these unequal treaties. And so our ultimate goal is to modernize to the point where we can get these foreigners out of our country. And so the only way we can do that in real terms is to modernize our army. And so when we see in the bottom right-hand corner, we see that the Japanese army is going to start embracing Western ideas and Western technology and Western weapons. Now, of course, there are people in Japan who don't like this happening. There are some daimyo that don't like this because they like things the way they were, right? Before the United States showed up, the daimyo and the nobility were in charge. They had all the land, all the power, and so now, if we change our society, it's not going to be a land based society anymore. We're not going to be feudal anymore. It's going to be based off of who controls industry. And so there are some daimyo who disagree with the emperor and they say, no, 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 this is not how we should be. We don't like the West. We don't want to copy the West. And so they're going to try to maintain their samurai, traditional Japanese lifestyle. The emperor is going to say, no, we're outlawing the samurai lifestyle. He gets rid of traditional Japanese dress. He makes people dress in more modern outfits. He says you have to get rid of your samurai swords. Anything that is symptomatic of the old lifestyle has to go away. And so we see this purposeful, rapid change that is orchestrated by the government to move Japan, quote unquote, forward into a more Western society. Of course, all of this is called, and make sure you know this, the Meiji Restoration, this idea of quickly modernizing Japan. So now let's talk. So those were some of the Enlightenment reforms. More, to what extent we've talked about how much it really is adopting the Enlightenment. And then let's talk about some of their economic reforms. And so the Japanese, like, well, okay, we want to modernize, but we have no idea how to run a factory. We've never done it before. We have no idea how to design new machines. We need scientists and engineers. Basically, today we'd call it STEM education. And so what they do is what a lot of people have done. We've talked about the Ottomans doing this. We talked about the Qing dynasty doing this, the Russian Empire doing this. They're going to send their best and their brightest, their young people, to college in the West, to Europe and the United States, and we're going to learn from them how to be scientists and engineers and businessmen. And then we want them to come back and tell us how we can modernize. In the top right-hand picture, you see this Japanese police officer on the left. He is telling this samurai, we don't dress like this anymore. You must adopt Western dress. And so we can see this clash of old versus new going on. So, all right, so we send our young people out west, and they come back and they say, okay, so this is how you open up a factory, this is how you engineer machines, this is how you modernize your military. And so the government is going to sponsor industrialization, right? We're not going to wait around to develop a capitalistic class. We're not going to try to figure out how the free market works. That's going to take too long. We need to industrialize now, and we need to get those foreigners out now. So just like in Russia, we see a government-sponsored, a government-directed and led quick, rapid industrialization. And so the government is going to open up factories, totally on the government dime. They're going to open up factories, and even though we can't pass tariffs because we have to have had to sign these unequal treaties with Europe and the United States, it doesn't matter. We are going to be able to grow these Japanese factories because the government owns them. And so in the first few years, as they don't make much of a profit because people in Japan will buy foreign goods because they're produced cheaper and better and faster because the West knows what they're doing at this point as far as industrialization goes. And so people aren't going to be buying Japanese goods in Japan very much. But it doesn't matter because the government owns these new baby Japanese factories, and so they don't have to make a profit. The government doesn't have to make a profit. And so it'll take a few years, but we'll start to figure out how to run these factories efficiently, bring our costs down, and eventually these baby factories will grow up and they'll start to be able to compete with the foreign goods. Now, of course, the United States was able to do this by passing tariffs. England was able to do this by passing tariffs, protecting their homegrown baby industries. We've already talked about Japan couldn't do that because of the extraterritorial treaties. And so this is how the government kind of overcomes that obstacle, having the government in charge of factories. Now, eventually, when these factories reach the point where they can stand on their own. They don't need to be babied anymore. They can compete with Western imports. Then the government is going to do something fascinating. They are going to then hand over control of these government factories to the daimyo, right? And so here's a dramatic shift in the social structure of Japan. In the past, the daimyo got their power from being land ownership having land and being feudal. And now, to reward the daimyo for following him, the emperor is going to give these daimyo control of factories. And so we're not going to call them daimyo anymore, these powerful ruling families, these nobility of Japan. We're now going to call them zaibatsu. It's the same families, but now their money and their power is coming from owning factories and not so much land anymore, because we've made the switch from feudalism to industrialization. And so these zaibatsu are going to be these families who own these big, huge industries. And so the Mitsubishi family would be one that we might know today and recognize their name, the Kawasaki family. These were daimyo families that now have control of certain industries in Japan, but we just call them zaibatsu. So as that is all going on, now let's talk about infrastructure. And so we had said that one of the key concepts in the AP course guide is that students should know that technology is going to fuel industrialization. So if we have better, more efficient ways of getting resources and transporting resources, that's going to bring costs down and profits up. And so in the United States, we talked about the Transcontinental Railroad. In Russia, we talked about the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And so here in Japan, the government is going to engage in a government paid for, government sponsored, built infrastructure building boom. Roads, bridges, steamships, railways. And so the government is going to try to, again, this is the Meiji Restoration, force us as fast as possible into a modern, industrialized, westernized world. That includes also creating more public education. So this is a little bit of enlightenment, give more people access to having better lives through education, but it also fits with industrialization because we want an educated workforce that we can pull from for future capitalists or future businessmen or future engineers, people that can run the factories, fix the machines. And so it is a little bit of enlightenment, but also a little bit of industrialization. It makes sense economically to have a more educated workforce. We don't want just a workforce full of peasants because we're not really basing our wealth anymore growing food. Now we are basing our wealth on how much we can produce and sell. Now, who's going to pay for all of this? I mean, we had said the government is going to build these roads, and the government is going to, build these factories. And so, of course, we're going to put it on the shoulders of the peasantry. So all of those people that the Tokugawa, when they did their reforms, forced back onto the farm, well, we're gonna bleed them dry. We're gonna take as much as we possibly can in food and in wealth to finance this government industrialization. Now, we talked about this in Russia happening, and we talked about how the peasants got angry and they started to protest. They started to make marches. When we see some of these peasants in Japan make the transition from working in the countryside to working in urban factories, they're going to have long hours, low wages, unsafe working conditions, just like we see in every part of the world that has factories. But they're not allowed to unionize because unions are going against what the company wants them to do. The company, whether it's controlled by the government or these new zaibatsu, they want to increase profits. They want to increase production. And so we want workers working as fast as possible, as long as possible, and we don't want to spend money on more wages or safe working conditions or shorter hours. And so we're going to say to the workers, you guys cannot unionize. Now, if we talked about this, the same exact thing is happening in Russia at this point when the Tsar said no unions. And we had said that, okay, so that makes the workers more radical. It makes them think about socialism and communism and anarchy. So does the same thing happen here in Japan? And the answer is no, is that there's just too much of a combination, a concentration of power at the top that is able to block any kind of successful mass uprising by the lower classes. We have the government, the emperor he has the control of the army, he has gotten the support of the major powerful daimyo, now zaibatsu families, and so we see that they're all on the same page, the upper class, and so as a united front, they're able to suppress any lower class resentment. Also alleviating this to some extent is that the Japanese government is now going to start talking about nationalism, right? It's called, Japan is going to have their own nationalism, like we're Japan and we're going to be powerful and strong. And so that will kind of distract the masses about a little bit from their problems. Also, Japan is going to start going into wars. And so It's, the government's going to say, don't rebel, don't strike, don't protest because that's unpatriotic in a time of war. So that's distracting the masses. We had talked about the Russian Tsar trying to do this as well at this time. And then also the standard of living, even though we're going to have long hours and low wages and unsafe conditions, the standard of living is still going to go up for the peasantry because they're going to start living in urban areas more than they did in the past as we industrialize. And that's still less hours than a farmer or a peasant had to do. They're going to get access to more food because of better transportation, more products because costs are going to come down with industrialization. And so that is going to be kind of a factor. The standard of living raising is going to relieve some of this building stress about why we're angry, and we're not getting any power in the lower classes. So some Japanese peasants that are angry, if they have the money and they have the freedom to leave, they will. And this is a form of protest. And so we see some disaffected, some upset Japanese peasants or factory workers. If they have the means, they will leave. And so this is just a large part of this larger theme of immigration in the world at this time. And so the Japanese notably will be moving to the United States. In the last half of the 19th century, the United States has jobs, and the United States needs agricultural workers. So if you go to the west coast of the United States, we need agriculture workers in California to pick vegetables, or if much closer to home, the Japanese will migrate to Hawaii, which is owned by the United States at this point, and they'll be used as labor on sugar plantations and pineapple plantations. And so here's just another example because of new technology that makes transportation and migration cheaper. Just another group of people moving around the world at this time. So let's now kind of reassess. Was the Meiji Restoration, was it successful? And absolutely it was, as far as in terms of economic ideas. Japan, by combining this united front of the government, of the emperor, and the daimyo, and keeping that upper class happy and cohesive, they are going to be successful in keeping revolutions from happening, but also they're all on the same page with industrialization goes. And so Japan becomes so powerful, so modern, so industrialized, and their empire becomes, their army becomes more modern, that they're able to eventually tell the foreign powers, including the United States, get out. We are not going to honor these extraterritorial treaties anymore that you made us sign, these unequal treaties. We're not going to honor your extraterritorial rights. If you don't like it, too bad. We have a modern military now. And so in 1898, they're able to just kick the foreigners out, which is a source of tremendous pride for the people of Japan. And so this kind of feeds into the growing Japanese nationalism at the time. So, all right, so we've kicked the foreigners out. Now the next step is to go become our own imperial country. We've kicked out the imperial nations of the United States and Europe, and so now it's our time to shine. And so we see at the very end of the 19th century, Japan decides to use its modern military to go get colonies for themselves. And so what they do is, the very first thing they'll do is they'll go and they'll invade Korea. Now at this point, Korea was a tributary state to the Qing dynasty, and Japan knows the Qing dynasty is falling. They haven't been able to successfully industrialize, and so they're able to steal that away. Now, they want Korea because, one, it makes the Japanese nationalism feel like we're better than other people, so that's part of it. But also, Korea has markets that we could force people to buy our stuff that we're making in Japan, but they also have raw materials. And Japan is always suffering from this. They're an island nation, Japan, and they just have very limited access to coal and oil and iron ore, and so these are things that we can get on the mainland of Asia. And so they're able to go do this, and so in the Sino-Japanese War, Sino means Chinese, from 1894 to 1895, they take away Korea, and this is an example of the decline of the Qing dynasty and the rise of the Japanese Empire. Now, as they start to expand, as the Japanese start to expand their empire west into the mainland of Asia, of course, this goes with our previous part of this lecture, part 1, they're going to come right up against the growing Russian Empire that is also industrializing and modernizing. And so these two countries are going to fight a war. It's slightly outside this time period because it is in the early 20th century, but we'll talk about it while we're here. And it's the Russo-Japanese War. And in part 1, we had talked about this, and the Japanese are able to win this war against the Russians because they have just been more successful modernizing their army and industrializing. So at the conclusion of this war, Russia has to publicly admit that Japan has Korea, and also Russia has to back off from their claims over Manchuria, which is what both Japan and Russia want, this very coal, iron ore rich part of mainland China. And so we see that the Russians are humiliated, and so we had talked about the impact that has on the Tsar back in Russia, but Japan seems to be vindicated, right? Japan, now the people of Japan are very proud of their country. They've defeated the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War, and now they've defeated this modern industrialized country, the Russians, in the Russo-Japanese War. And as we look ahead into the 20th century, into the next time period, we're going to see that this Japanese imperial march is just going to continue. When we get into the next time period, we'll talk about Japan just outright taking Manchuria and then all of China and then most of mainland China, and that gets us into World War II. So that's in the future, but this is just the beginning of that expansion of Japan. And that ends our lecture. Hope you enjoyed it.